34,000 ivory beads. A single grave, heavy with gold. Those numbers do not happen by accident. In 1972, archaeologists in Varna, Bulgaria, began uncovering a cemetery that held roughly 3,000 gold objects. And one grave held more worked gold than any other site of its age. Far to the north, at Sunghir, on the Russian plain, children were buried under strings of thousands of ivory beads about 34,000 years ago. These finds are not random piles. They are choices people made and left behind. So the Stone Age shows signs of rich and poor. Wealth could buy a fancier burial and a louder memory. The old question is simple. Were rich and poor a thing back then, or did inequality only start with farms and kings? At Varna, the cemetery had roughly 3,000 gold objects and at least one grave overflowing with gold beads. Scholars use a Gini number to measure inequality. 0 means equal. 1 means one person has everything. At Sunghir, about 34,000 years ago, burials included thousands of ivory beads and decorated spears. Put the burials and the house-size numbers side by side, and status looks older than farming. The graves and the guineas measure different things, but they point the same way. Archaeologists dug an old cemetery at Varna on Bulgaria's Black Sea coast. They found it in 1972. It dates to about 4,600, 4,200 BCE. One burial, called Grave 43, held a pile of golden beads. The metal was worked into collars, decorated plates, and small gleaming ornaments. In Grave 43, close to 1,000 gold pieces could be arranged over one body like jewelry armor. Quick thing before we go on. If you're enjoying this, like and subscribe to help us grow. Okay, back to it. This was not a palace find. It predates kings and states by centuries. Archaeologists read those burials as signs of unequal wealth. Some people left with far more goods. At the Varna Cemetery, Grave 43 held an extraordinary concentration of gold, roughly 1,000 gold objects, about 1.5 kilograms, plus heavy copper tools, dated about 4600 to 4200 BCE. Excavators opened Grave 43 in 1972. The skeleton lay under a dense cluster of beads, sheet gold, and copper tools. The concentration of metal in one burial suggested extraordinary wealth for that person. Most other graves at Varna had only a few beads or simple shell ornaments, nothing like Grave 43. That uneven pattern implies social rank. Some prehistoric people controlled wealth, paid specialists, and traded over distance before cities existed. At Sunghir, east of Vladimir in Russia, they dug graves dated to about 34,000 years ago. They buried adults and children together, laid out with care and many objects. Their clothing was sewn with thousands of tiny beads carved from mammoth-ivory. Those beads made collars, belts, and braided panels. It was a full-body display, not a trinket. They pushed personal display to the limit long before farming made hoarding useful. At Varna in Bulgaria, around 4,600 BCE, they buried one man, Grave 43, with around 1,000 gold objects, more gold than any other burial on Earth at that time. Sunghir had thousands of mammoth-ivory beads. Those two sites, Sunghir and Varna, create a hard question. People showed elaborate personal wealth, both in a very old period and later on. In a Nature paper, archaeologist Timothy Kohler and his colleagues converted house sizes into a Gini number to track inequality across prehistory. If you're enjoying this so far, like and subscribe. We do this every week. We find the old reasons behind your modern habits. To read wealth in dirt, archaeologists count objects and contexts. At Sunghir, burials lay beneath thousands of tiny beads made of bone, ivory, and shell. The Varna Cemetery held roughly 3,000 gold objects in total. And one grave, Grave 43, held about 1,000 of them on a single body. Researchers measured it with house sizes. Kohler's team turned floor areas into Gini numbers in Nature. The same inequality metric economists use today. Those numbers are not decoration. They are measurable inequality, a social ledger written into the soil. Kohler's team turned houses into numbers. The spread of floor sizes across a settlement becomes a Gini score. Other archaeologists count beads, pendants, and tools in graves. Kohler's team measured house floors. Two different rulers, one question, who had more? Then they used a Gini-style score. 0 means equal, 1 means total inequality. And the grave evidence points the same way. A burial, like Grave 43 at Varna, is inequality you can hold in your hand. That method lets researchers compare hunter-gatherers and early farmers on one scale. Kohler's team did not invent inequality. They measured how it looked in the past. House floor area became the stand-in for wealth. Bigger home, bigger share. Grave goods tell a parallel story in the cemeteries. Then they turned those counts into one number, the Gini, where 0 means everyone equal and 1 means one person owns everything. The Gini scores climb and fall across time. Inequality was a bumpy road, not a single jump. The peaks are real. Sunghir's bead-stuffed burials show hoarding tens of thousands of years before farms. And Varna, an early farming world, shows where it went next. Farming wasn't a simple switch for inequality. They could lock up the rare stuff, worked gold and copper. At Varna, dated about 4600 to 4200 BCE, burials held concentrated gold with one person. A single skilled maker could make thousands of beads by hand. At Sunghir, about 34,000 years ago, people were buried with thousands of ivory beads. Control of trade routes, exotic stone, and ritual privilege let one person keep most valuables. In 1972, they opened the Varna Cemetery on Bulgaria's Black Sea shore. About 290 graves and over 3,000 gold objects, dated to roughly 4,500 BCE. One tomb, labeled Grave 43, held about 1,000 gold pieces and worked copper. More gold in one grave than the rest of the excavated world owned at that date. Metalworking took practice. Some copper was hammered straight from native nuggets. Pulling metal out of ore took furnaces, charcoal, and know-how few possessed. Smelting ore demanded sustained, furnace-hot fires and real skill. Knowledge only a few controlled. Ore was rare on the plain. They brought it from distant Balkan sources. Early mines like Rudna Glava show people were digging copper in the 5th millennium BCE. Put skill, scarce ore, and long trials together, and a person or small group could control metal and hoard it. That was a real route to wealth long before palaces or taxes existed. At Sunghir, in what is now central Russia, about 34,000 years ago, they buried adults and children under thousands of tiny mammoth-ivory beads and pierced shells. Those beads did not feed anyone. Each bead came from mammoth-ivory. Drilling and smoothing, one took hours of careful handwork. They wore those beads in collars and belts at public rituals and marriage gatherings, visible signs of who belonged to which family or ally. Some researchers argue those hours of display bought a place in the social queue. More mates, stronger allies, steadier help. It's a hypothesis, but the beads are the receipt. That is a form of primal social accounting that could make inequality stick. In the Kalahari, anthropologist Richard Lee wrote down one rule: never praise a hunter. Hunter-gatherer bands flattened status with jokes, refusals, and immediate sharing of meat. So, archaeologists face two stubborn facts: social leveling in many groups and occasional big hoards. At Varna, around 4500 BCE, one tomb held close to 1,000 gold ornaments, unlike anything in the neighboring graves. Sunghir buried children with thousands of ivory beads about 34,000 years ago. And Timothy Kohler's nature paper put numbers on the trend. Measuring house sizes across dozens of sites, inequality climbs as people settle down. At Sunghir, on the Russian plain, people were buried wrapped in thousands of worked ivory beads, an ornate grave dated to about 34,000 years ago. Those beads had no practical use. They were pure prestige and clearly visible. At Varna, between 4600 and 4200 BCE, the cemetery held roughly 3,000 gold objects, and a handful of graves held most of it. Researchers like Kohler put those finds on a scale, building Gini-style charts from bones, graves, and craft concentrations to read how wealth was spread. So, a ladder appears. Early prestige in deep prehistory, pockets of big wealth like Varna, and later Bronze Age city-states with mass inequality. Material technology was the primal hardware that made those gaps bigger. Stone, bone, and gold preserve well. Leather, tents, and food do not. Varna, on Bulgaria's Black Sea coast, dated c. 4600 to 4200 BCE, yielded early ritual gold. Far earlier, at Sunghir in Russia, they buried children with thousands of carved ivory beads. And researchers like Kohler used a Gini-style measure on houses and burials to estimate inequality. Still, preservation tricks the eye. Some things last and others vanish. But graves are choices. Burying gold or thousands of beads is a public message. Messages matter. Yes, the best clue is the grave itself. At Varna in Bulgaria, around 4500 BCE, some burials held heaps of gold, while neighboring graves had almost nothing. At Sunghir, roughly 34,000 years ago, 2 children were buried under thousands of ivory beads, beadnets laid over them like sewn collars. Archaeologists also find bone-sewing needles and fragments of hide with regular stitch holes. Direct evidence they made fitted clothes and sewn ornament, not loose rags, and it's measurable. Timothy Kohler's team computed Gini scores from house sizes across 60-plus sites and found inequality rising long before cities, so no crown or palace is necessary to show rank. These different burials prove some people had higher status and special dress. At Varna, graves contained more than 3,000 gold objects. Those ornaments were not junk. They were placed on bodies to mark ritual rank. At Sunghir, about 34,000 years ago, 2 burials were wrapped in thousands of mammoth-ivory beads. Wealth also bought safety and influence. Kohler's Gini estimates tied inequality to concentrated social power. So grave goods were social investments, bets placed into ritual memory that outlived the owner. If you had to choose, most groups would take a bag of food over a string of beads. Still, at Sunghir, 2 buried children wore thousands of mammoth-ivory beads. A nature paper, led by Timothy Kohler, turned house sizes into a way to spot real inequality. The bigger the gap between homes, the bigger the gap between lives. Why trade food for beads? Because alliances and reputation often kept people alive more than a single meal. Varna's cemetery held thousands of gold pieces, a clear signal that ritual wealth could outbid hunger. That's the odd logic of primal economies. At Varna, on Bulgaria's coast, one burial from 4600 BCE, grave 43, held around 1,000 gold objects. At Sunghir, 34,000 years ago, 2 children were wrapped in roughly 5,000 ivory beads each, over 10,000 between them. In a 2017 Nature paper, Kohler and colleagues used house sizes to estimate inequality and found Gini levels in some ancient settlements rivaling later chiefdoms. So, this is not a modern accident. Inequality could stay small and occasional, or when trade, technology, or ritual choices concentrated wealth, it could scale up fast. Your ring echoes Varna's grave 43, where one man was buried with extraordinary gold. At Sunghir, 34,000 years ago, burials were wrapped in thousands of mammoth ivory beads. Researchers used Gini numbers. Kohler's nature study found inequality rose with settlement. The form changed, beads to rings, hoards to bank numbers, but the social rules stayed the same. Locking a watch in a safe repeats an ancient move? Turning things into power? If this hooked you, hit that subscribe button. We dig into the ancient gears that still run your life. Status and the hunger to be remembered. Varna, Bulgaria, about 4,500 BCE. Graves there were packed with hundreds of gold ornaments. Sunghir, Russia, 34,000 years ago. 2 children buried under roughly 5,000 ivory beads each. And if this pulled you into the ancient world, do one quick thing. Like and subscribe to help us grow. Subscribe if you want more episodes that show how your instincts, your status drives, and your body were built by people who buried treasure to be remembered.